Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadows of medieval society to meet someone you've probably never really thought about. Not the king, not the knight, not even the peasant. We're talking about the executioner. And here's the thing, everything you think you know about these people is probably wrong. They weren't hooded monsters hiding in castle dungeons. They were real people with families, neighbors who knew their names, and lives far more complex than Hollywood would have you believe. So dim the lights and let's uncover what it was really like to live as society's most necessary outcast. Picture yourself walking through a medieval town at dawn. The church bells are ringing. Market vendors are calling out their wares. Children are running through narrow streets while their mothers hang laundry from second-story windows. Everything looks exactly like you'd imagine from the movies. Stone buildings, wooden carts, people in rough wool clothing going about their daily business. But there's something most people don't mention about these charming medieval towns. Something that made them function in ways we don't really talk about anymore. Medieval towns needed law and order just like any community. But how they maintained it was far more complex than simple punishment. You couldn't just throw someone in jail for 30 days and call it justice. These communities operated on a completely different system. They needed visible, unmistakable consequences for breaking the rules. And those consequences had to be dramatic enough to keep everyone else in line. We're not talking about a slap on the wrist here. We're talking about a system designed to make sure everyone understood exactly what happened when you crossed certain lines. Public executions weren't just about justice. They were carefully orchestrated theatre designed to control entire populations. Think about it. You gather the whole town in the main square. Everyone from children to grandparents comes to watch. The local officials make speeches. The clergy offers prayers. The condemned person gets their final moments to confess or make peace with their fate. And then, in front of everyone, the state demonstrates its ultimate power. The power to end a human life. That's not just punishment. That's a message being broadcast to every single person in that crowd. The executioner wasn't some random brutal thug either. This was a trained professional whose work kept the delicate balance of medieval society from falling apart. These people had to know exactly what they were doing. One wrong move, one botched execution, and that carefully orchestrated theatre could turn into a riot. The crowd could turn against the executioner, against the officials, against the entire system. So the person wielding the axe or sword had to be skilled. They had to be reliable. They had to be someone who could perform under the most intense pressure imaginable. Here's something that might surprise you. These weren't frequent bloodbaths either. Most towns might see only a handful of executions per year, if that. Some years, there might be none at all. The average medieval town wasn't running through executioners like we go through morning coffee. These events were rare enough to be major occasions, special enough that people would travel from neighboring villages to witness them. The rarity actually made them more powerful, not less. But the presence of the executioner, even when not working, sent a constant message to everyone about the consequences of stepping out of line. You'd see this person in the market. You'd know who they were. You'd know what they did. And every time you saw them, you'd be reminded that the state had someone ready and willing to carry out its ultimate punishment. That psychological pressure worked on the entire community every single day. Not just on execution days. The whole system depended on having someone willing to do the job that literally nobody else wanted to touch. And I mean nobody. This wasn't like being a blacksmith or a baker where multiple people might compete for the same position. This was a job that came with complete social isolation. It meant your family would be shunned. It meant your children would grow up as outcasts. It meant you'd live on the literal edge of town, separated from everyone else. Who volunteers for that kind of life? But here's what's really interesting. How do you find someone to take on a role that will destroy their social life forever? How do you convince someone to become the person everyone fears and nobody wants to associate with? The answer tells us everything about how medieval society actually worked versus how we imagine it worked. Because the truth is darker than most people realize. Most executioners never chose the profession at all. They were forced into it by circumstances completely beyond their control. Maybe their father committed a crime and the family was given a choice. Take on the executioner role or face execution themselves. Maybe they were criminals themselves who were offered this job instead of death. Maybe they were desperately poor and it was literally the only way to feed their families. The idea that someone just decided one day to become an executioner is mostly fantasy. The social stigma followed you everywhere. Other families wouldn't marry into yours. Other professions wouldn't accept you. You were marked for life, and so were your children, and their children after them. The job became a family curse that could last for generations. Some executioner dynasties operated in the same towns for over a century, passing the role from father to son, because literally no one else would do it. The economics trapped people too. Once you became an executioner, you couldn't just quit and become a shopkeeper. Who would buy from you? You couldn't become a craftsman. Who would hire you? You were stuck in this role because medieval society made sure there was nowhere else for you to go. They needed executioners, but they also needed to make sure those people stayed separate from everyone else. It was a perfect trap, and once you were in, there was almost no way out, which brings us to something even more disturbing. The way these roles were passed down through families, like some kind of twisted inheritance that destroyed lives for generations. Imagine waking up one morning to discover your entire family's future has been decided by something your father did, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. You're maybe 10 years old. You don't understand politics or crime or punishment. But suddenly, every adult in your life is looking at you differently. The other kids aren't allowed to play with you anymore. Your mother is crying. And someone is explaining that your father has become the town executioner, which means you will be too someday. There's no discussion. There's no choice. Your life path was just carved in stone by circumstances you had nothing to do with. Most executioner positions weren't job applications. They were family curses that lasted for generations. The system worked this way because medieval society needed executioners, but they also needed to make sure these people stayed separate from everyone else. So once a family took on the role, they made it impossible for that family to ever leave it. It was social control disguised as necessity. The community got their executioner, and they got the peace of mind knowing that person couldn't integrate back into normal society. A father might be forced into the role as punishment for a crime, or to save his family from starvation, but his decision would trap his children too. Maybe he stole some bread during a harsh winter. Maybe he got into a fight that went too far. Maybe he just owed money to the wrong people. The authorities would offer him a choice: death or become our executioner. Most fathers would choose life, thinking they were saving their family. They had no idea they were actually condemning them to generations of isolation. The children born into these families grew up knowing their futures were already decided. Boys would follow their fathers into the profession. Girls could only marry into other executioner families. There was no alternative career path, no opportunity to become a merchant or a craftsman or anything else. You were born into the role the same way others were born into nobility or peasantry, except your inherited status came with complete social exile. These execution dynasties formed across Europe because once a family took on the role, no other family would marry into them. Think about what that means practically. If you're a normal medieval family looking for a spouse for your son or daughter, you have plenty of options within your social class. But executioner families only had each other. They created these isolated bloodlines that existed parallel to normal society but could never join it. The system reinforced itself perfectly. Regular families wouldn't associate with executioner families, which meant executioner families could only associate with each other. Their children played together, grew up together, and eventually married each other. Generation after generation, these families became more and more isolated from the rest of the community. They developed their own networks, their own traditions, their own ways of surviving in a world that needed them but didn't want them. Some families tried to escape, but the social stigma followed them for generations, even if they never touched an axe. Records show families who moved to different towns, changed their names, tried to start over in new places. But medieval Europe was smaller than we imagine. Word traveled. People remembered. Even if a family managed to hide their history for a while, eventually someone would recognize them or figure out who they were. The stain was permanent. The children and grandchildren of executioners faced rejection, even when they had never performed an execution themselves. A son might refuse to follow his father's path, but that didn't matter to potential employers or marriage partners. The association was enough. The fear was enough. These people were marked by something their ancestor did, sometimes decades before they were even born. The psychological impact on these families was devastating. Children grew up knowing they were different, knowing they were feared, knowing they could never have normal relationships or normal lives. They watched their parents struggle with isolation and depression. They saw how other families looked at them with a mixture of fear and disgust. And they knew this was their future too, no matter what they personally wanted or dreamed of. Some executioner children ran away from home, trying to escape their fate. But where could they go? Medieval Europe didn't have anonymous big cities where you could reinvent yourself. Communities were small and interconnected. Everyone knew everyone, or at least knew someone who knew someone. A runaway executioner's child would eventually be recognized and sent back home, or worse, punished for trying to abandon their family duty. The economic system reinforced the social isolation. Executioner families often received special payments, free housing, or tax exemptions. These benefits made it financially difficult to leave the profession, but they also marked the family as different from everyone else. Other people saw these special privileges, and it reinforced the idea that executioner families were separate, other, not like the rest of them. What started as one man's desperate choice became a permanent family identity that defined dozens of lives across centuries. A father's moment of weakness or survival instinct created a legacy that shaped his children, his grandchildren, and their children too. The original crime or circumstance that forced the first generation into the role became irrelevant. What mattered was the family name, the family profession, the family curse. These weren't just individual tragedies either. We're talking about entire bloodlines that existed on the margins of society for hundreds of years. Families who served their communities faithfully, but were never accepted by them. People who did necessary work but paid for it with permanent exile from normal human relationships and social participation. But the social isolation these families faced was unlike anything else in medieval society, creating living conditions that forced them to survive in ways that would surprise anyone who thinks they understand how medieval communities really worked. You know that feeling when you're not quite welcome somewhere? Maybe you walk into a restaurant and the host gives you a look that says you don't belong. Maybe you show up at a party where everyone stops talking when you enter the room. That uncomfortable sensation where you know people wish you weren't there. Now imagine that feeling defining every single day of your entire life. From the moment you wake up until you go to sleep, everyone around you makes it clear that your presence is unwanted, even though they absolutely need you to be there. Executioners weren't just doing a job. They were living in a permanent state of social exile while remaining essential to their communities. This wasn't like being unpopular at school or having a few enemies in town. This was systematic exclusion from nearly every aspect of normal medieval life. The same people who depended on executioners to maintain law and order made sure those executioners could never participate in the society they were protecting. They were literally forced to live on the physical edges of towns, often in houses built specifically to keep them separate from everyone else. Picture the layout of a typical medieval town. The church sits in the center square. The market surrounds it. The wealthy merchants live on the main streets. The craftsmen have their workshops nearby. The regular working families fill in the residential areas. And then, way out on the very edge, sometimes beyond the town walls entirely, you'll find the executioner's house. Built far enough away that normal people don't have to see it or think about it most of the time. These weren't just random housing assignments either. Town councils would specifically designate where executioner families could live, and it was always as far from the respectable areas as possible. The houses came with the job, but they came with a clear message. You belong here, but not really here. You're part of this community, but only on its absolute margins. Some executioner houses were built with special features like separate wells or gardens, because sharing water sources or food supplies with normal families was considered contaminating. Churches wouldn't let them in for services. Think about how central religion was to medieval life. Church wasn't just Sunday morning worship. It was baptisms, weddings, funerals, feast day celebrations, community meetings. It was where you went to mark every major life event and to maintain your social connections. Executioner families were banned from participating in any of it. Some churches had specific rules written into their charters excluding executioners and their families from entering the building. They were considered spiritually unclean just by association with their profession. Public baths banned them. Medieval public baths weren't just about getting clean. They were social spaces where people gathered, gossiped, conducted business, and maintained community relationships. Executioner families couldn't use them. The belief was that sharing bathwater with an executioner would contaminate everyone else. So these families had to find other ways to stay clean, usually involving private arrangements that cost more and provided less social interaction. Many civic buildings had rules specifically excluding executioner families. Guild halls, government buildings, market halls, inns, taverns. The list of places where executioner families weren't welcome was longer than the list of places where they were allowed. Some establishments posted signs or symbols indicating that executioners weren't permitted. Others just relied on social pressure and the understanding that these families knew they weren't wanted. In some places, they had to wear special clothing or markings so people could identify and avoid them on the street. Imagine walking through town wearing something that immediately tells everyone you encounter exactly who you are and what you do. Some regions required executioners to wear specific colors or symbols. Others mandated certain types of hats or clothing styles. The point was to make sure no one accidentally interacted with an executioner family member without knowing their profession. But here's the twisted part. These same communities that shunned them also depended on them completely for maintaining law and order. The very people who wouldn't let executioners into their churches or bathhouses were the same people who demanded quick, efficient executions when criminals were sentenced to death. They wanted the service, but they wanted the service providers to remain invisible and separate the rest of the time. The contradiction was built into the entire system. Towns needed executioners to function properly, but they also needed those executioners to be social outcasts. If executioner families were accepted into normal society, it might make the whole population more comfortable with violence and death. The exclusion was deliberate. It maintained the psychological barrier between normal life and the ultimate punishment the state could impose. They got certain perks like free lodging and exemptions from taxes, but only because nobody else would provide services to them normally. The free housing wasn't generosity, it was necessity. No landlord would rent to an executioner family. No one would sell them property. The tax exemptions weren't rewards for good service. They were compensation for the complete economic isolation these families faced. Without these special arrangements, executioner families would have had no way to survive at all. Children of executioners grew up knowing they could never have normal friendships or relationships with anyone outside their isolated world. Picture being 6 years old and trying to understand why the other kids aren't allowed to play with you. Your parents explain that it's because of what daddy does for work, but you're too young to really understand what that means. All you know is that you're different, and that difference makes other families afraid of you. These children learned early that their social circle would always be extremely limited. They could be friends with other executioner children, and that was about it. They could marry into other executioner families when they grew up, but regular families were off limits. They would inherit not just their parents' profession, but also their parents' isolation from the rest of the world. They became liminal figures, absolutely crucial to society's functioning, yet permanently banned from participating in that society. They existed in a strange space between necessary and forbidden, essential and excluded. Their very presence reminded everyone that civilization required people willing to do terrible things, but that same civilization couldn't bear to acknowledge those people as fully human. And this isolation forced them to develop some very unexpected skills to survive in a world that needed them, but refused to embrace them. Here's something that would blow your mind. The same hands that ended lives often save far more lives than they ever took. We're talking about a complete reversal of everything you'd expect from these people. While everyone else saw executioners as dealers of death, these men were quietly becoming some of the most skilled medical practitioners in their communities. The irony is almost too perfect. The profession everyone considered the most morally corrupt was producing healers who understood the human body better than anyone else around. Executioners developed an intimate knowledge of human anatomy that made them surprisingly valuable as medical practitioners. Think about what their job required. They needed to know exactly where to strike to kill someone quickly and cleanly. That meant understanding bone structure, muscle placement, major arteries, the nervous system. They had to know how joints worked, where organs were located, how much force was needed to cut through different types of tissue. This wasn't theoretical knowledge from books. This was hands-on, practical understanding of how human bodies actually functioned. Most medieval people knew almost nothing about anatomy. Even many physicians worked from ancient texts and guesswork. But executioners saw the inside of human bodies on a regular basis. They knew what healthy organs looked like versus diseased ones. They understood how blood flowed, how bones connected, how muscles attached to each other. Their professional duties gave them medical knowledge that took doctors years of study to acquire, and executioners learned it through direct experience. While people feared and shunned them socially, they secretly sought them out when they needed medical help that nobody else could provide. Picture this scenario. Your child falls from a tree and breaks their arm so badly, the bone is sticking through the skin. The local physician takes one look and shakes his head, says there's nothing he can do. Maybe suggests prayer and hope for the best. But someone whispers that the executioner knows how to set bones properly, how to cut away damaged tissue without killing the patient, how to stitch wounds that won't heal right on their own, so you swallow your pride and your fear. You carry your injured child to the house on the edge of town that everyone pretends doesn't exist. You knock on the door of the man everyone calls spiritually contaminated, and you beg him to save your child's life. Because despite everything society says about executioners being monsters, you know this man has skills no one else possesses. The numbers tell the real story here. Executioners, like Franz Schmidt, treated thousands of patients during their careers. Schmidt specifically kept detailed records showing he treated over 15,000 people for various injuries and illnesses. Compare that to the roughly 300 executions he performed over his entire career. That means he healed about 50 times more people than he killed. The math makes it clear what these men were really doing with their time. They knew exactly how the human body worked, where to cut, how to set bones, and which herbs could ease pain or prevent infection. Executioners learned to identify different types of fractures and the best methods for setting them properly. They understood which cuts would heal cleanly and which ones would become infected. They knew how to stop bleeding, how to prevent shock, how to recognize when someone was dying versus when they could be saved. Their knowledge extended beyond just cutting and stitching too. Many executioners became experts in herbal medicine. They learned which plants could reduce pain, which ones fought infection, which ones helped bones heal faster. This knowledge often came from treating their own injuries or illnesses. Since regular physicians wouldn't treat executioner families, they had to become their own doctors out of necessity, and that self-taught expertise made them valuable to others. Many executioners became the closest thing small towns had to surgeons, especially for injuries that required precise cutting or amputation. When someone got their hand caught in mill machinery or suffered a severe infection that threatened to spread, people turned to executioners. These men knew how to amputate limbs cleanly, how to tie off blood vessels properly, how to minimize pain during the procedure. Skills that came directly from their execution training but saved lives instead of ending them. Executioners also handled childbirth complications that midwives couldn't manage. When a baby was positioned wrong, or the mother was bleeding too heavily, executioners sometimes stepped in with surgical skills that could save both lives. Their understanding of anatomy and their steady hands under pressure made them valuable in medical emergencies that terrified everyone else. This created an incredible moral paradox. People who viewed executioners as spiritually contaminated would still trust them with their lives. The same community members who wouldn't let executioner families into church would secretly visit them for medical treatment. They'd pay these supposedly evil men to heal their children, set their broken bones, and save them from death. The hypocrisy was stunning, but it reveals something important about human nature. When you're desperate enough, social prejudices become less important than survival. The medical practice also created strange relationships between executioners and their communities. People who owed their lives to executioner families couldn't completely shun them afterward. There was an awkward gratitude that complicated the usual social isolation. Some patients became protective of their healer, defending executioner families against criticism from people who had never needed their medical services. Some executioners made more money from their medical practice than from executions, since actual death sentences were relatively rare. Medical emergencies happened far more often than capital punishment. Broken bones, difficult births, infected wounds, animal attacks. These situations provided steady income for executioners who developed good reputations as healers. The medical work also gave them purpose beyond their official duties, a way to feel useful that didn't involve killing people. The profession that society deemed the most morally corrupt often produced the most skilled healers in the community. The same training that made someone effective at ending lives also made them effective at saving lives. The knowledge was identical. The tools were often the same. Only the intention changed, but their medical knowledge came from mastering tools that required absolute precision. And those tools themselves tell a fascinating story about medieval craftsmanship and the deadly serious nature of the executioner's primary profession. Imagine your job performance being judged by hundreds of angry spectators who might riot if you make even the smallest mistake. Picture standing in front of a crowd that's already worked up, already emotional, already looking for someone to blame if things don't go according to plan. Now imagine that your professional reputation, your personal safety, and possibly your life depend on executing a perfect performance under those conditions. No pressure, right? This was the reality for medieval executioners every single time they stepped up to do their job. An executioner's tools weren't just weapons. They were precision instruments that required years of practice to master. Each piece of equipment served a specific purpose and demanded different skills to use properly. The difference between a successful execution and a disaster often came down to the quality of the tools and the executioner's ability to use them correctly. These weren't crude implements wielded by barbaric thugs. They were sophisticated instruments designed for efficiency and reliability. A botched execution could literally get the executioner killed by an angry mob, so every swing had to be perfect. Crowds came to executions expecting a clean, quick death. They wanted to see justice served efficiently. When executions went wrong, when the condemned person suffered unnecessarily, when blood sprayed everywhere because of poor technique, the crowd's mood could shift in seconds. They'd turn from spectators into an angry mob targeting the executioner who failed to do his job properly. The sword for beheading represented the pinnacle of execution technology. These weren't ordinary military weapons. Execution swords were specifically designed for their purpose. They had to be kept razor sharp at all times. The blade needed perfect balance for accurate swings. The handle required precise grip design so it wouldn't slip during the crucial moment. Most execution swords were larger and heavier than combat weapons because they needed to deliver enough force to sever a neck completely in one clean stroke. The executioner had to swing at exactly the right angle. This meant understanding human anatomy perfectly, knowing where the vertebrae connected, calculating the right amount of force for different sized people, accounting for the condemned person's position and any movement they might make at the last second. The margin for error was essentially zero. Miss the target by even a small amount, and you'd create a horrifying scene that could turn the entire crowd against you. Many regions operated under a 3-stroke rule. If you couldn't complete the execution in 3 attempts, you faced serious punishment yourself. Some areas were even stricter, demanding success on the 1st or 2nd attempt. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty toward executioners. It was practical crowd control. Long, drawn-out executions created chaos. People got sick watching repeated attempts. Families of the condemned suffered unnecessarily. The longer an execution took, the more likely something would go wrong with crowd management. Executioners who repeatedly failed the standard faced dismissal, public humiliation, or in extreme cases, execution themselves. The job came with built-in quality control that could cost you everything. Some executioners lost their positions after just one badly botched execution. Others got multiple chances, but lived under constant pressure to perform perfectly every time. The fear of failure shaped how they approached every aspect of their work. The rope for hanging required completely different expertise. Knot tying became a specialized skill that determined whether someone died quickly or suffered for minutes. The rope thickness, length, and material all mattered. Too thin and it might break. Too thick and the knot wouldn't tighten properly. The length had to be calculated based on the condemned person's weight and height. Too much drop and you'd risk decapitation. Too little and death would come slowly from strangulation rather than a quick neck break. Different regions preferred different hanging methods, each with its own technical requirements. Some used short drops that killed through strangulation. Others used calculated drops designed to break the neck instantly. The executioner had to master whichever method his region preferred and adapt to special circumstances like unusually heavy or light condemned prisoners. Breaking wheels demanded perhaps the most precise technical knowledge of all execution methods. This wasn't random violence. The executioner had to break specific bones in a particular sequence to create the desired effect. Too much force too early, and the person died before the punishment was complete. Too little force, and the suffering extended far beyond what authorities intended. The timing, placement, and strength of each strike required extensive practice and anatomical knowledge. Wheel executions also required special tools beyond the wheel itself. Heavy mallets or iron bars for breaking bones. Ropes for securing the condemned person properly. Knowledge of which bones to break first, which ones to save for later, and how to gauge the condemned person's condition throughout the process. This method demanded more skill and experience than any other form of execution. Executioners spent hours maintaining their tools and practicing their technique because their own survival depended on their skill. Sword blades needed constant sharpening and care to prevent rust or damage. Ropes had to be inspected regularly for wear that could cause them to break at the worst possible moment. Wheels required maintenance to ensure they rolled properly and didn't have rough spots that might interfere with the execution process. Practice sessions happened away from public view, often using animal carcasses or specially designed training equipment. Executioners worked on their swing accuracy, their knot tying speed, and their ability to perform under pressure. They studied anatomy texts when available and learned from more experienced practitioners. The technical aspects of the job required as much dedication as any other medieval craft. What looked like brutal violence to spectators was actually a highly technical skill that took years to develop safely. The crowd saw death and blood and assumed they were watching mindless brutality. They didn't see the years of training, the careful preparation, the precise knowledge required to make executions work properly. The executioner's expertise made the whole system function smoothly, but that expertise remained invisible to most observers and the pressure of performing perfectly extended far beyond just the tools themselves into the complex social theatre that surrounded every public execution. Every execution was like a carefully scripted play, and the executioner was just one actor in a much larger performance. You might think these events were just about killing someone quickly and moving on with the day, but that's completely wrong. Public executions were elaborate productions that involved dozens of people, followed strict scripts, and required perfect timing from everyone involved. The executioner wasn't the star of this show. He was more like a supporting actor who had to hit his marks perfectly, or the whole thing would fall apart. Public executions followed strict rituals designed to send specific messages about justice, morality, and state power. These weren't random killings carried out whenever someone felt like it. Every execution happened according to a detailed plan that had been worked out weeks or months in advance. Officials decided on the time, the location, the method, even the specific words that would be spoken. Nothing was left to chance because too much was at stake. The message being sent wasn't just about the individual criminal being executed. It was about the power of the state to control life and death, about the importance of following laws and social rules, about what happened to people who challenged authority or committed serious crimes. Every person watching was supposed to leave that execution with a clear understanding of their place in society and the consequences of stepping out of line. The executioner had to balance multiple competing demands during these events: efficiency, dignity, religious protocol, and crowd management. He needed to kill the condemned person quickly and cleanly to satisfy the crowd's expectations. But he also needed to show proper respect for religious ceremonies happening around him. He had to maintain the dignity of his office while dealing with what was essentially a public slaughter. And he had to keep an eye on the crowd's mood, ready to adapt if people got restless or angry. These competing demands created incredible pressure. Move too fast and you might interrupt religious ceremonies or appear disrespectful to officials. Move too slow and the crowd gets impatient. The condemned person suffers unnecessarily, and the whole event loses its intended impact. The executioner walked a tightrope between multiple groups of people, all with different expectations about how the execution should proceed. The condemned person would be led to the execution site in a formal procession that looked like a religious parade. Guards marched in formation. Officials wore their ceremonial robes. Clergy carried religious symbols and led prayers. The condemned person walked through the middle of this procession, sometimes in chains, sometimes allowed to walk freely depending on their crime and social status. This wasn't just transportation from the jail to the scaffold. This was part of the theatre, designed to show the solemnity and authority of the justice system. The procession route was carefully planned to maximize the number of people who could see it. Streets were chosen to pass by important buildings like churches, government offices, and wealthy merchant houses. The message was clear. Justice comes from legitimate authority, it follows proper procedures, and it has the backing of both religious and secular power. Chaplains delivered prayers and tried to secure last-minute confessions from the condemned. This wasn't optional spiritual comfort. This was a required part of the ceremony. The church needed to demonstrate its role in the justice system. Officials wanted confessions because they validated the execution and sometimes revealed information about other crimes or criminals. The condemned person's spiritual state affected how the crowd perceived the entire event. If the condemned person confessed and showed proper repentance, the execution took on a different tone. People saw justice being served against someone who acknowledged their guilt. If the condemned person maintained their innocence or refused to participate in religious ceremonies, The crowd might become sympathetic or hostile depending on the specifics of the case. Judges maintained ceremonial authority over the proceedings, even though the actual killing was done by the executioner. They read the charges aloud. They announced the sentence. They gave the final signal for the execution to proceed. This wasn't just bureaucratic procedure. It was a demonstration that the state, not individual executioners, controlled life and death decisions. The executioner often wore special ceremonial clothing for these events. Not the black hood and mysterious robes you see in movies, but distinctive outfits that marked his official role. Some regions required specific colors or symbols. Others had traditional garments that had been used by executioners for generations. The clothing served multiple purposes. It distinguished the executioner from guards and officials. It showed respect for the ceremony, and it reinforced his role as a representative of state authority rather than a personal killer. He had to time his actions perfectly with the religious and legal requirements happening around him. Wait for the chaplain to finish prayers. Listen for the official signal from judges. Watch for cues from crowd management personnel. The actual killing was just one moment in a complex sequence of events that all had to flow together smoothly. Sometimes the condemned person received elaborate final meals. Other times, just bread and water, depending on their crime and social status. Wealthy criminals or those convicted of crimes of passion might get requests granted. Multiple courses, expensive wine, foods they particularly enjoyed. But criminals convicted of treason, murder, or crimes against children might receive minimal food. These differences weren't random. They were part of the message being sent about different types of crimes and criminals. If the crowd became unruly or the execution went wrong, the executioner bore the blame for disrupting this carefully orchestrated drama. Officials could claim they followed proper procedures. Clergy could point to their completed religious duties. But if people rioted or the execution became a bloody mess, everyone looked at the executioner as the person who failed to do his job properly. This blame assignment wasn't fair, but it was practical. The executioner was the most visible participant and the easiest target for crowd anger. Blaming him protected other officials and maintained the legitimacy of the justice system, even when individual executions went badly. The whole event was designed to reinforce that the state, not individuals, controlled life and death decisions. Every aspect of the ceremony emphasized legitimate authority, proper procedures, and collective responsibility for justice. The executioner wasn't a freelance killer. He was an agent of state power, carrying out decisions made by judges, approved by officials, and blessed by clergy. Executioners weren't just killing people. They were performing in a complex social ritual that held medieval society together through demonstrations of power, order, and consequence. But the reality of how often they actually had to perform this ritual might surprise you, because most executioners spend far more time preparing for executions than actually carrying them out. If you think executioners spent their days chopping off heads, you're in for a reality check about what they actually did with their time. Picture this. You wake up as a medieval executioner. You check your schedule for the day. No executions planned. None tomorrow either. Actually, you haven't had an execution in 3 months, and you might not have another one for 6 more months. So what exactly do you do with yourself? Sit around sharpening your axe and waiting for someone to commit a capital crime? Not quite. Most executioners went months or even years between actual executions, which created a very different daily reality than you'd expect. The average medieval town wasn't exactly a hotbed of capital crime. Sure, people got into fights, stole things, cheated on their taxes, and generally caused trouble. But crimes serious enough to warrant execution were relatively rare. Murder, treason, serious theft, repeat offences by habitual criminals. These things happened, but not every week or even every month in most communities. This created a strange employment situation. Towns needed executioners available at all times, but they couldn't predict when they'd actually need them. It was like being on call for a job that might happen tomorrow, or might not happen for 2 years. You had to maintain your skills, keep your equipment ready, and stay physically and mentally prepared for work that was completely unpredictable. They needed other sources of income and purpose, which led them into jobs that seemed completely contradictory to their main role. Think about it from the town's perspective. You're paying someone to be available for executions, but executions are rare. That person needs to eat and support their family during the long stretches between their official duties, so you find other work for them to do. Work that nobody else wants to handle. Many executioners served as market inspectors, checking weights and measures to make sure merchants weren't cheating customers. This job made perfect sense when you think about it. Executioners were already social outcasts, so they couldn't be bribed or influenced by merchant families the way normal inspectors might be. They had nothing to lose socially by enforcing unpopular regulations. Plus, they were detail-oriented people who understood the importance of precision in their work. Market inspection involved testing scales to make sure they gave accurate weights, checking measuring containers to ensure they held the amounts they claimed, examining bread loaves to verify bakers were using the right proportions of ingredients, inspecting meat to make sure it was fresh and properly prepared. These tasks required trust from authorities and gave executioners steady income between their primary duties. Some executioners handled disposal of animal carcasses for butchers and farmers, dead horses, cattle that died of disease, animals that were too sick or injured to sell. Someone had to get rid of these carcasses before they became health hazards, and executioners were already comfortable dealing with death. They knew how to dismember large bodies efficiently and where to dispose of remains safely. Some oversaw prostitutes or were responsible for driving lepers and beggars out of town, basically handling anything society found distasteful. Prostitution existed in medieval communities, but it needed regulation to prevent problems. Executioners monitored brothels, collected taxes from prostitutes, and made sure these businesses operated within whatever legal boundaries existed locally. Driving out undesirables was another job that required someone willing to be disliked. Lepers, chronic beggars, people with mental illnesses, foreigners without proper documentation. Communities wanted these people gone, but didn't want to handle the removal process themselves. Executioners did the dirty work of telling people to leave town and making sure they actually left. Others worked as torturers during interrogations, which actually happened far more frequently than executions. Medieval justice systems relied heavily on confessions, and torture was considered a legitimate way to extract information from suspected criminals. This work was more regular than executions, but just as unpleasant socially. Executioners who served as torturers might work several times per month, providing steadier income than their primary profession. Torture required many of the same skills as execution: precise knowledge of human anatomy, understanding of how much pain someone could endure without dying, ability to work calmly under pressure while causing deliberate suffering. The tools were often similar too: ropes, knives, devices designed to apply controlled force to human bodies. The numbers tell the real story about executioner workloads. A typical executioner might perform only a few dozen executions during their entire career, sometimes fewer than 20 total. Compare that to hundreds or thousands of market inspections, dozens of torture sessions, countless animal carcass disposals. The execution part of the job was actually a tiny fraction of what these people did for a living. Some executioner families kept detailed records of their work, and the pattern is consistent across different regions and time periods. Years might pass between executions. Individual executioners might go their entire careers without performing more than 10 or 15 actual death sentences. The work that defined their social identity and determined their family's future was something they rarely actually did. Even during periods of high political tension, most executioners spent more time maintaining their equipment than using it. Swords needed regular sharpening and oiling to prevent rust. Ropes had to be inspected and replaced when they showed wear. Wheels and other specialized equipment required maintenance and storage. The preparation time far exceeded the actual usage time for most executioner tools. The unpredictability meant they had to be constantly ready, but rarely actually needed for their primary function. This created psychological stress that's hard to imagine. You couldn't plan vacations or travel because an execution might be scheduled suddenly. You had to stay in shape and keep your skills sharp for work that might not happen for months. You lived in a state of permanent readiness for something that defined your entire life, but occupied very little of your actual time. Being an executioner was less about constant killing and more about being society's designated handler of unpleasant necessities. They became the people communities turned to when jobs needed doing that nobody else wanted to touch. And the financial reality of this irregular work created its own set of challenges that shaped how executioner families survived in a world that needed them but preferred to pretend they didn't exist. You might think being the only person willing to do society's dirtiest work would make you rich, but the economics were more complicated than that. Picture yourself in a profession where everyone needs your services, but nobody wants to associate with you. Where demand is essential but completely unpredictable. Where your skills are valuable, but your social status makes normal business relationships impossible. This was the strange financial reality that executioner families navigated every single day. Executioners received a mix of fixed salaries, per execution fees, and unusual perks that reflected their unique social position. The payment system varied wildly from region to region, but it always acknowledged that these people weren't just employees. They were social outcasts performing necessary work that regular citizens couldn't or wouldn't do. Communities had to create special economic arrangements because normal employment relationships didn't apply to executioner families. Some executioners received annual salaries from their towns or regions, a guaranteed income that provided basic security regardless of how many executions actually happened. But these salaries were usually modest, barely enough to support a family without additional income. The real money came from individual executions, but that created a perverse situation where executioner families might secretly hope for more death sentences to improve their financial situation. While some payments were generous, the irregular work and social costs made financial planning nearly impossible. You couldn't predict your income from year to year because you couldn't predict how many executions would take place. Some years might bring 5 or 6 executions. Other years might bring none at all. How do you budget for groceries or plan for your children's future when your primary income source is completely random? A single beheading might pay several shillings, which was decent money for a day's work in medieval terms. But executions were unpredictable and infrequent, so that good pay had to stretch across months of uncertainty. Imagine getting paid well for one day of work, then not knowing when your next payday might come. Maybe next week, maybe next year. The feast or famine cycle made executioner families live in constant financial anxiety. The payment amounts also varied based on the method of execution and the social status of the condemned person. Beheading someone of noble birth might pay significantly more than hanging a common thief. More complex execution methods, like breaking on the wheel, commanded higher fees because they required greater skill and time. But again, you couldn't count on getting the high-paying jobs with any regularity. Some executioners had special rights that provided additional income streams. In France, certain executioners held droit de havage, which allowed them to take goods from markets or collect tolls from travelers. These weren't exactly salaries, but they were legal ways to extract money from the community that employed them. The rights recognized that executioner families needed income sources beyond their irregular primary duties. Market rights might allow an executioner to take a portion of goods from every merchant's stall. A handful of grain from this vendor, some cloth from that one, a few coins from another. Not enough to hurt any individual merchant significantly, but enough to provide steady sustenance for the executioner's family. Toll collection worked similarly, taking small amounts from many people rather than large amounts from a few. They often received free housing and exemptions from certain taxes, but only because normal economic relationships were closed to them. The free housing wasn't generosity from kind-hearted town councils. It was practical necessity. No landlord would rent to an executioner family. No one would sell them property at any price. The community had to provide housing because the alternative was having no executioner at all. Tax exemptions worked the same way. Executioner families couldn't participate in normal economic activities that generated tax revenue anyway. They couldn't join guilds, operate businesses, or engage in regular commerce. Exempting them from taxes they couldn't pay anyway was cheaper than creating special taxation systems for people who existed outside normal economic structures. Many executioners made more money from their side jobs than from actual executions. Healing practices, market inspection duties, waste disposal services, torture work during interrogations. These activities provided steadier income than the unpredictable execution schedule. Some executioner families developed thriving medical practices that far exceeded their official duties in both frequency and profitability. The medical work created interesting economic dynamics. People who wouldn't socialize with executioner families would still pay them for healing services. They'd bring their sick children to the executioner's house, pay good money for surgical procedures, purchase herbal remedies and medical advice. The same social isolation that limited other economic opportunities actually enhanced their medical practices by eliminating competition from regular physicians who served only respectable families. The social isolation meant they couldn't invest in normal businesses or partnerships, limiting their economic opportunities severely. Executioner families couldn't become silent partners in merchant ventures. They couldn't invest in workshops or trading expeditions. They couldn't loan money to other families or participate in the complex credit relationships that drove medieval commerce. Their money stayed within their isolated social circle. This isolation created a strange parallel economy. Executioner families traded with each other, married within their professional community, and developed business relationships that existed separately from the broader economic system. They became economically self-contained because they had no choice. Some executioner families accumulated significant wealth over generations, especially those who developed successful medical practices or held valuable market rights. Money passed from father to son along with the professional obligations. Some families became quite prosperous within their limited social sphere, owning multiple properties and maintaining comfortable lifestyles. But they could rarely convert that wealth into social respectability. Rich executioner families were still executioner families. Money couldn't buy acceptance into regular society. Wealthy executioners still lived on the edges of towns. Their children still faced social isolation. Their families still couldn't marry outside their professional caste. Financial success didn't translate into social mobility the way it did for other medieval families. The job paid well enough to survive, but the social costs meant executioners lived in a strange economic bubble separate from normal medieval commerce. They existed in parallel economic structures that served their unique needs while reinforcing their isolation from mainstream society. And breaking free from this bubble required extraordinary circumstances that few executioner families ever managed to achieve. Everything you think you know about hooded, anonymous executioners hiding in castle dungeons is basically Hollywood fiction. You've seen the movies. The mysterious figure in a black hood standing silently in the shadows, face completely concealed, identity unknown to everyone except maybe the king or some evil lord, living in dark stone cells beneath the castle, emerging only to carry out secret executions in the dead of night. It's dramatic, it's mysterious, it's perfect for creating atmosphere in films and books, and it's almost completely wrong. Popular culture has created a completely false image of how executioners actually looked and operated in medieval society. The hooded, faceless killer makes for great storytelling, but it bears almost no resemblance to historical reality. These myths have become so embedded in our collective imagination that most people can't picture a medieval executioner any other way. When you hear the word executioner, you probably automatically think of that black hood and anonymous figure. But that image comes from centuries of fictional storytelling, not from actual medieval records. The reality was often the exact opposite of these dramatic myths, which makes the true story even more fascinating. Real executioners lived in the open. Their neighbors knew their names, their families, their daily routines. They walked through town markets, attended public events when allowed, and conducted their business in full view of their communities. The secrecy and anonymity that define fictional executioners would have been impossible in actual medieval society. Most executioners didn't wear hoods or masks during their work. They were known members of their communities who operated in full view of everyone. When an execution took place, hundreds of people gathered to watch. Everyone knew exactly who the executioner was. His face was visible. His identity was public knowledge. The idea of hiding behind a mask would have been pointless, since everyone already knew who he was and where he lived. The practical reasons for this openness are obvious when you think about it. Executions were public ceremonies designed to demonstrate state authority. Officials wanted everyone to see that justice was being carried out properly by legitimate representatives of the law. A mysterious hooded figure would undermine that message. People might wonder who was really doing the killing and whether proper legal procedures were being followed. Instead of hiding their identity, many executioners wore distinctive clothing or markings that made their role immediately recognizable to townspeople. Special colored garments, distinctive hats, or ceremonial accessories that marked them as official executioners. Some regions required these identifying features by law. The goal wasn't concealment, it was identification. Communities wanted people to know immediately when they were interacting with an executioner. These identifying markers served multiple social functions. They warned people who might want to avoid contact with executioner families. They established the executioner's official authority during public ceremonies. They reinforced the social boundaries that kept executioner families separate from everyone else. Concealment would have defeated all these purposes. They didn't live in castle dungeons either. They had normal houses, just located away from the main town areas. Most executioners were employed by towns or regions, not by individual nobles with private castles. They needed family homes where they could raise children, tend gardens, and conduct the daily business of living. The dungeon image comes from later periods and specific situations that weren't typical of medieval executioner life. Executioner houses were usually modest, but comfortable structures built on the outskirts of communities. They often came with small plots of land for growing food or keeping animals. Some had workshops where executioners could maintain their equipment or practice their medical skills. These were functional family homes, not mysterious prison cells. The mysterious silent killer image ignores the fact that executioners often had to interact with crowds, officials, and clergy during their work. Public executions required coordination between multiple parties. Executioners needed to communicate with judges about timing and procedures. They had to work with chaplains during religious ceremonies. They sometimes had to manage crowd control or respond to unexpected situations during executions. Silent, anonymous figures couldn't handle these complex social interactions. Executioners needed to be recognizable authority figures who could command respect and maintain order during chaotic public events. They were more like master craftsmen performing specialized work than mysterious assassins carrying out secret missions. Some regions did use branding or ear cutting to mark executioners, but this made concealment impossible, not necessary. Physical marking served the same function as distinctive clothing. It identified executioners immediately and permanently. You couldn't hide facial brands or missing ears under a hood. These marks were designed to be visible, to make sure everyone knew exactly who they were dealing with. The branding and marking practices were cruel, but they were also practical. Medieval society needed ways to identify people in communities where most people couldn't read, and official documentation was limited. Physical marks provided instant, unmistakable identification that couldn't be forged or hidden. The hooded executioner myth probably comes from much later periods and specific regional practices that weren't universal across medieval Europe. Some later executions did use masks or hoods, particularly in situations involving political prisoners, or when executioners feared retaliation. But these were exceptions, not standard practice. The iconic image represents unusual circumstances that got amplified through centuries of storytelling. Medieval life varied so widely across regions and centuries that no single image captures the diversity of executioner experiences. What was true in one place might be completely false in another. Practices that applied during one time period might have been abandoned or changed in different eras. The medieval period lasted roughly 1,000 years and covered an enormous geographic area. Generalizing about any aspect of medieval life is dangerous, but it's especially misleading when it comes to executioners. The real executioners were far more complex and human than the mythical figures we see in movies and books. They were ordinary people trapped in extraordinary circumstances. They had families, financial concerns, health problems, and personal relationships. They struggled with the moral implications of their work and the social isolation it created. They were skilled craftsmen, medical practitioners, and community members who happened to perform one of society's most difficult jobs. And some of these real people managed to achieve something remarkable that no fictional executioner ever could. They found ways to escape their profession entirely. After everything we've learned about social exclusion and family curses, you might wonder if anyone ever escaped this life. Picture spending your entire existence knowing that your profession has marked you and your children for permanent exile from normal society. Imagine watching your kids grow up isolated and ostracized because of work you never chose to do. Most executioner families accepted this as their permanent fate, but a few exceptional individuals refused to accept that their bloodline was forever cursed. A few exceptional executioners managed to restore their family honor and transition to respectable careers, but it required extraordinary effort that most people couldn't sustain. We're not talking about simply quitting your job and finding new work. We're talking about undoing generations of social stigma through decades of perfect behavior and exceptional service. The process demanded skills, connections, money, and patience that few executioner families possessed. The path to redemption was long, expensive, and never guaranteed to work, even for the most skilled and dedicated individuals. You couldn't just petition some office and request rehabilitation. You had to prove your worthiness through years of exemplary conduct, while continuing to perform the very duties that marked you as an outcast. Think about the psychological toll, working as an executioner while simultaneously trying to demonstrate that you deserve to escape that role. Killing people while proving you are worthy of joining respectable society. Franz Schmidt represents the most famous example of successful rehabilitation. This man spent his entire adult life executing a careful strategy to restore his family's honor. Schmidt didn't just perform his execution duties, he transformed himself into a model citizen while carrying out the work that made him a social pariah. Every execution he performed was documented meticulously. Every interaction with officials was conducted with perfect professionalism. Every aspect of his public life was designed to demonstrate his worthiness for rehabilitation. Schmidt spent decades building a reputation as a skilled physician and public servant, while carrying out his execution duties. Remember, executioners often developed impressive medical knowledge through their work. Schmidt took this further than most. He treated thousands of patients during his career, becoming one of the most trusted healers in his region. He kept detailed records of his medical work, documenting successful treatments and surgical procedures that saved lives. His medical practice gave him positive interactions with community members who might otherwise have avoided him completely. People who wouldn't socialize with an executioner would still bring their sick children to him for treatment. Gradually, Schmidt built relationships with families across all social classes who owed their lives or their loved ones' lives to his healing skills. He carefully documented every case, maintained impeccable professional standards, and gradually earned respect from officials and citizens who witnessed his dedication to excellence. Schmidt's execution records are incredibly detailed. He noted the crime, the method of execution, the behavior of the condemned person, and any complications that arose during the procedure. This documentation showed officials that he approached his duties with seriousness and precision, rather than casual brutality. His professional standards extended beyond just his primary duties. Schmidt participated in civic activities when permitted. He contributed to community discussions about public health and safety. He offered his expertise during medical emergencies that affected the broader population. Slowly, carefully, he positioned himself as a valuable community member whose executioner role was just one aspect of his broader service to society. Eventually, Schmidt petitioned imperial authorities to restore his family's honor, arguing that his service had redeemed his father's original disgrace that had forced the family into the executioner profession in the first place. This wasn't a casual request. It was a formal legal proceeding that required extensive documentation and multiple testimonials from respected community members. Schmidt's petition emphasized that his decades of faithful service had more than compensated for whatever crime his father had committed generations earlier. He pointed to his medical work, his professional conduct, his contributions to community welfare. He argued that his family had paid their debt to society many times over and deserved restoration to respectable status. The process took years and required testimonials from judges, clergy, and other respected community members vouching for his character and contributions to society. These testimonials had to come from people whose own reputations were solid enough that their endorsements carried weight with imperial authorities. Schmidt had to cultivate relationships with these influential figures over many years before he could ask for their support. Judges testified about Schmidt's professional conduct during executions and his cooperation with legal proceedings. Clergy members spoke about his moral character and his contributions to community welfare. Wealthy citizens who had benefited from his medical services provided testimonials about his healing skills and personal integrity. Building this network of supporters took decades of careful relationship management. Even after official rehabilitation, former executioner families often carried the memory of their past for generations. Legal restoration of honor didn't immediately erase social memories or prejudices. People still remembered what Schmidt's family had been, even after imperial authorities declared them rehabilitated. The stigma faded gradually rather than disappearing overnight. Some families changed their names and moved to different regions after achieving rehabilitation, hoping to start completely fresh in communities where their history wasn't known. But medieval record-keeping and communication networks made complete reinvention difficult. News traveled between communities. People migrated and carried information with them. Family histories had ways of surfacing even when people tried to hide them. The children and grandchildren of rehabilitated executioner families sometimes faced lingering social challenges. Potential marriage partners might investigate family backgrounds and discover the executioner history. Business associates might learn about past family professions and react negatively. Complete social integration took multiple generations, not just legal paperwork. Escape was possible, but rare, requiring a combination of exceptional skill, political connections, and decades of patient effort that few executioner families could sustain. Schmidt's success story represents the absolute best-case scenario for executioner rehabilitation. Most families lacked his medical skills, his political acumen, or his extraordinary patience and determination. And their legacy extends far beyond the scaffold into areas that shaped how we think about justice, medicine, and social control even today. The medieval executioner's story reveals something profound about how societies create the roles they need, even when those roles come with terrible personal costs. These weren't monsters or volunteers. They were ordinary people trapped by circumstances in an extraordinary profession that shaped their families for generations. Next time you see a hooded executioner in a movie, remember the real people who lived on society's margins while keeping it functioning, healing more than they harmed, and carrying burdens we can barely imagine. Thanks for joining me tonight. If these historical stories help you unwind, subscribe for more fascinating tales designed to ease you into peaceful sleep.